right, welcome in everyone to another deep dive. And this one, well, this one's for you, the learner. You sent in this amazing source, part 2 of Plato's Gorgias, and you really want to get into it, huh? Rhetoric, persuasion, its place in society, how we learn, the whole deal, and we're here for it. We're going to try to pull out those key takeaways, see if we can make them relevant for today, maybe even spark some of those aha moments along the way. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan. And yeah, it's a rich text. Plato always gives us a lot to think about.
Doesn't he, though? Okay, so right out of the gate, we've got Gorgias making some pretty bold claims about the power of orators. He doesn't just paint them as, skilled public speakers, but as these central figures in civic life, advisors, influencers, shaping big decisions.
He even says, and this is a wild one, that a really skilled speaker can be more convincing than, get this, an actual expert when talking to a crowd.
Whoa, hold on. More convincing than an expert? Think about that.
I know, right? This makes you really stop and think about the power of persuasion in action. How we as humans are wired to respond to it, doesn't it?
Big time. I mean, we see this playing out all the time, right? You've got these charismatic figures, politicians, activists, you name it, who can rally people around a cause, even if, sometimes, the actual facts, from experts in those areas are kind of saying something different.
Exactly. And it's so fascinating how this idea that Gorgias presents way back in ancient Greece still resonates today. I mean, Think about the debates we have now about misinformation, about how easily people can be swayed by emotionally charged arguments, even when they might contradict scientific evidence or expert opinion.
It's almost like sometimes the delivery, the packaging of the message, it can be more important than the actual content. It makes you wonder how we separate, style from substance and how much weight we should give to each when we're forming our own opinions.
Right. Are we evaluating the ideas themselves, or are we just kind of swept up in the way they're presented?
Big question. And Gorgias doesn't stop there. He then brings up this whole ethical dimension, though he frames it more in terms of accountability. So his argument is that if a rhetorician, a skilled speaker, misuses their skills, does something harmful, the blame should be on them, the individual, not on the person who taught them the art of rhetoric.
He's very careful to distinguish between the tool itself, the skill of rhetoric, and how it's actually used.
I see. So he's saying rhetoric itself is neutral, like a hammer, right? A hammer can build a house or, cause harm depending on the person using it. But with something as powerful as rhetoric, where you're directly shaping people's beliefs, their actions, does that separation of skill and use, I don't know, does that feel a little, maybe a bit too clean cut?
It's a good question. Is there some inherent responsibility that comes with having that kind of persuasive power? I mean, after all, it's not just about hammering nails. It's about shaping minds.
Right. It's like, okay, sure, the teacher gives you the tools, the techniques of rhetoric, but shouldn't there also be some ethical guidance along the way, some sense of responsibility for the outcomes?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because on one hand, you have the mechanics of rhetoric, right? Like how to construct an argument, how to appeal to emotions. Those things in themselves aren't inherently good or bad. It's the intent behind them and, of course, the consequences that really bring in the ethical questions.
So it becomes a matter of individual responsibility. How you choose to use these tools, the potential impact you have on others, that's where the real ethical weight lies.
It's a debate that continues today, especially with the rise of social media and all these new avenues for persuasion and influence.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this ancient Greek take on rhetoric, its power, the ethics involved. Now, our source does something really interesting here. It jumps ahead and brings in this modern perspective from a scholar, Dr. Bobby, and he tries to connect these classical ideas to how we understand things like English studies today, specifically the relationship between rhetoric and composition, and then literature.
Yeah, this is where we start to see how these old ideas are still relevant, still shaping how we learn and think about knowledge in the modern world.
Right. So Dr. Bobby suggests that sometimes in academia, you get these artificial divisions because of overspecialization. He argues that literature often dives into the what questions, like what are the major themes in Hamlet, or what was daily life like in Victorian England?
But then you've got rhetoric and composition, and those fields tend to focus on the how questions. Like, how does this essay work to persuade its audience? Or how is this marketing campaign designed to influence consumer behavior?
Interesting. So it's content versus approach, in a way. Literature digs deep into specific content and context, whereas rhetoric and composition, they step back and analyze the underlying mechanisms of communication itself. The mechanics of persuasion, those can be applied across any topic, any field.
It gets to the heart of how we communicate effectively, how we make our ideas resonate, how we create impact with our words.
And that, I think, goes back to what Gorgias was saying, right? About the skilled orator being able to speak persuasively on any topic. That seems to align with this how-focused approach in rhetoric and composition. It's not about being an expert in a specific subject, but about mastering the tools of persuasion themselves.
Absolutely. The principles of argumentation, the techniques for appealing to logic, to emotion, these are transferable skills. You can use them to analyze a political speech, craft a persuasive essay, even just to convince your friend to watch a certain movie. The underlying principles are the same.
It's about influence, and influence transcends subject matter. And Dr. Bobby also brings up this point about accountability in learning, and he traces it back to Gorgias. This idea that students, learners, you and me, we need to take ownership of our own learning journey, both the successes and the failures, and not just blame everything on external factors. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a reminder that education, learning, it's not a passive process. You don't just sit there and absorb information. You have to actively engage, put in the effort, and then learn from the outcomes, good or bad.
You're not just a vessel being filled, you're an active participant.
Exactly. So instead of just pointing the finger at the teacher or the textbook when things don't go well, Gorgias, at least as Dr. Bobby interprets him, is suggesting that the learner has to recognize their own role in the process. How much effort are you putting in? Are you really wrestling with the material? Are you reflecting on your mistakes?
It's about taking responsibility, right? It's not just about blaming others. It's about recognizing your own agency in your educational journey.
And that can be a powerful thing. It can be empowering to recognize that you have some control over how you learn, how much you learn, and how you respond to challenges.
Okay, so we've got Gorgias' take on rhetoric, its power, the ethics, and then this modern academic context from Dr. Bobby. Now, the Gorgias dialogue itself takes a turn here with the entrance of, well, you know who, Socrates.
The master of questioning, right. And he immediately sets the tone with this statement about how he loves to refute and be refuted, and that he actually finds being refuted, get this, more beneficial. Talk about a different approach to intellectual exchange.
It's like he's saying, bring on the challenges, prove me wrong, that's how I learn.
Exactly. He's not afraid of being wrong. In fact, he embraces it.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental part of his process of seeking truth.
And he dives right into it, using these analogies about builders and musicians, trying to get at this question, does simply learning rhetoric automatically make you a rhetorician? It seems so straightforward at first, but it gets really complicated really quickly.
Well, he's trying to define the nature of a skill, right? If you study all the tools and techniques of carpentry, does it automatically make you a builder? If you learn all the notes on a piano, does that make you a musician?
There's a difference between knowledge and application, I guess. You can know all the theory, all the rules, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can create something beautiful or, in the case of rhetoric, something truly persuasive.
What Socrates is getting at is this complex relationship between learning a discipline, acquiring the knowledge, and then embodying it, putting it into practice in a way that actually achieves the desired outcome.
And this leads to Socrates offering his own definition of rhetoric. He calls it a habitude of producing gratification and pleasure.
And it almost sounds, I don't know, a little dismissive, especially compared to how Gorgias initially described it, as this incredibly powerful force.
Yeah, like he's intentionally downplaying its significance.
Right. He's shifting the focus away from this idea of rhetoric as this lofty pursuit of truth and justice towards this, well, almost like a base desire for pleasing an audience.
So he's not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but that it's more about achieving this immediate, maybe superficial gratification, not necessarily about deep knowledge or, like we were talking about earlier, the ethical implications.
It's almost like he's saying it can be a bit of a trick, a way of manipulating people's emotions to get what you want.
And then to really drive his point home, he goes on to categorize rhetoric as part of this larger practice that includes things like cookery, personal adornment, sophistry. He lumps it all together and calls it, wait for it, a semblance of a branch of politics.
Ouch. That's a pretty sharp critique.
It is. So he's basically saying rhetoric, in his view, is more about appearances, about surface-level persuasion, rather than, genuine political action, which for Socrates is all about justice and the well-being of the citizens.
He's drawing a clear line between rhetoric as this kind of, I don't know, maybe shallow performance versus true statesmanship, which requires wisdom, virtue, a deep understanding of what's actually good for the community.
And to make sure everyone's on the same page, Socrates sets some pretty strict rules for the discussion, insisting on short, concise answers. It's almost like he's trying to control the very tools of rhetoric within a debate about rhetoric.
It's very strategic. He's imposing his own preferred method of inquiry, which is this very logical, step-by-step approach where every point is carefully examined.
Then we get to this heated exchange with Polus, who comes in with this very passionate defense of rhetoric. He argues that orators have immense power, like despots capable of doing great harm. It's a really stark image, right? The potential danger of persuasive ability in the wrong hands.
It highlights this idea that words have real power, that they can be used to manipulate, to control, to cause harm.
But then Socrates throws in this curveball. He says that orators and despots actually have the least power because they might do what they think is best, but not what they truly wish. That's a pretty mind-bending concept.
It is. So what he's getting at here is this difference between perceived power and actualized will. Someone might have the ability to make things happen, to influence others, but if they're not acting from a place of true understanding, if their actions ultimately lead to negative outcomes, then in Socrates' view, they haven't truly exercised power effectively.
So it's not just about getting what you want in the moment. It's about having the wisdom to know what you should want, what's truly good and beneficial in the long run.
Exactly. True power, for Socrates, is tied to knowledge, to virtue, to acting in accordance with what's actually right, not just what seems desirable on the surface.
Which leads to this challenge that Socrates throws at Polus. He wants Polus to prove that orators actually possess intelligence, that rhetoric is a true art, not just a form of flattery or manipulation. It's like he's saying, okay, if you're going to claim that rhetoric is so powerful, then show me that it's grounded in something real, something valuable.
He's forcing Polus to defend the inherent worth of rhetoric, to demonstrate that it's not just about winning arguments or pleasing the crowd, but that it's based on knowledge, on skill, on a genuine understanding of how to persuade effectively and ethically.
And this is where the concept of counterargument comes in. It's explained as this process of anticipating potential objections, addressing them head on, and then ideally refuting them in order to make your own argument stronger.
It's a key element of effective rhetoric. It's about being prepared, about thinking ahead, about considering the other side, and crafting your argument in a way that addresses those potential challenges.
And Dr. Bobby points out that Socrates, throughout his entire conversation with Polus, is essentially embodying the strategy of counterargument. He's constantly questioning, anticipating Polus's responses, and systematically dismantling his arguments through logic and reason.
It's a masterclass in debate, really. He's showing how to engage with opposing viewpoints in a way that's both intellectually rigorous and ultimately persuasive.
All right, so, the learner. We've gone deep into this. We've explored Gorgias's initial claims about the power of rhetoric, contrasted with Socrates' more critical examination of it. We've looked at the ethical dimensions, the role of the learner, and this idea of counterargument. So as we wrap things up, what are your takeaways? What stands out to you from this deep dive?
Think about that tension between the perceived power of persuasion and the potential for it to be used for manipulation or even harm. How do you see that playing out in your own life, in the world around you? How do you navigate those gray areas?
What about the distinction between those what questions and the how questions? Does that give you a new way to look at different fields of knowledge, different approaches to learning? Do you find yourself more drawn to the content or the method?
And then there's that idea of accountability in learning. Where do you see the responsibility lying? With the teacher, with the learner, or somewhere in between? How does that concept resonate with your own experiences as a learner?
And finally, how about Socrates' emphasis on counterargument? Does that make you want to approach your own arguments differently, to be more mindful of anticipating and addressing those opposing viewpoints?
It's all food for thought, right?
Absolutely. But here's one last thing to really chew on. If rhetoric, as Socrates suggests, is just this semblance of a branch of politics, this kind of superficial imitation, what does that say about how we engage with persuasive messages in the world today? Are we always discerning enough to see through the surface, to separate the substance from the showmanship, or are we often swayed by just the appearance of power and influence? It's something to think about as we navigate this ever more complex and persuasive world.
And with that, we'll leave you to ponder the learner.
Until next time.